Good morning, everyone. So I'll very briefly explain who I am. So I'm Adam Cooper, that's what the slide says, but I have a very deep technology background. I've spent a lot of time working on standards, but I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going to talk about how the humans relate to all of this, because that's what I care about the most. I care about how we can use these things for good, how we can help ourselves, and how we can move forward. And technology is going to support that. That's my belief. And so it's how we do that and how we put it in context. So I'm going to talk about the pillars, but none of this is new. We need these things already. We use them today. We need governance now. We need identity now. We use it all the time. When you open a bank account, you need to prove who you are. These things exist now. Security and privacy, none of it's new. But what is new is how we take it forward and make it better. So what can we do with these new technologies that will allow us to have concepts like portability of identity and trust, so we can make things better? It's never going to be a silver bullet. It's never going to solve all of the problems, and a lot of the panelists previous to this have spoken about that there are issues, absolutely. But when we look at where we are today, we can do things so much better, and that's what I want us to strive for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why users trust, just to make us think about how the real world works before we start diving into technology. Largely, we want things to be safe, and we don't want them to be obstructive. If things get in the way, if there's friction, we don't like doing them. What we want to do is get the thing done that we want to be done. And this is why people will click through privacy statements and things like that quite quickly, because there's something behind it that they want to get to. They don't read all that text. I mean, we know this, we all do it. People take shortcuts, it's human nature, because we want to get a thing, so we have an idea in our mind about what safe means and what trust means. So just for a little thought experiment, why do we trust the postman? We all have posts delivered to our houses. And we do it because of things that we know about real life. I mean, we see the right uniform. We might see the same person over time, multiple times. We may not even know that person's name. I don't know my postman's name. I know him to speak to. I say hi to him all the time. He brings my post. I trust it. And it's a regular service. It has a brand on the high street. I can identify with all these things, and all these things are evidence that I'm building my mind that I can link to real-life constructs. And what am I doing? I'm building up a pattern of identity. And I'm making a risk-based decision. And this is what it's really all about. And it's how we can use technology to do those things more reliably and simply, and maybe do them in an automated way and link them into transactions where we can do all these clever things like let's have these smart contracts, because these concepts are the same, whether they're in business or in the real world. I also know that there's a means of redress with a postman. I mean, if something goes wrong, if my post doesn't turn up, I know that there's an organisation behind that, the Royal Mail. It's been there for over 100 years. I know I can walk into a post office and I can talk to people. What I don't realise is that behind the scenes in the UK, those two things are actually different, and they have been for some time. But there's this sort of collective knowledge that there is that way we do things, and I trust it. So where I'm going to with this is that a lot of where trust comes from is from things we understand. And largely, most of the consumers of new technologies won't understand how security works. They won't understand the technology, and they don't need to, is my message here. We can spend a lot of time trying to explain to people what a blockchain is. Does it really matter? Probably not. What they need to understand are the positive benefits of these things. So how do we get that trust? Well, behind the scenes, we need some kind of rules for the ecosystem. And we've touched on some of these already today, some of the constructs. But we need to surface them in a way that users understand, wherever they might be in the ecosystem. Because, as I say, you're never going to get the point across that distributed ledger technology is this fantastic thing to a user. They don't want to hear that. They want to hear how it's going to help them. We also have to have practical means of redress. The more and more we use technology to solve these problems, the more and more it gets industrialized. And the greater the threat can be if something goes wrong. If you put more and more reliance into these kind of technologies, all of a sudden the impact is huge when things go badly wrong. But there needs to be, from my view, far more effort going into, well, how do we fix the bad problems? How do we fix it when identity is compromised, when fraud occurs, when things can be done so fast and so industrialized that the impact is massive. And there doesn't, for my liking, there isn't enough thought going on in that area, and I think there should be. We need to make it clear to people how the law acts on these things. We need to be very careful that we observe all of the privacy things, the aspects of this as well, and make sure that people are protected, and systems are protected, and organisations are protected. And that's very important. We also need to create tools. I mean, part of the tools I just mentioned about redress and fixing issues are important, but we also need the more basic tools about how do I manage my consent, when that consent could be spread across so many different things very, very quickly, almost virally. How do you deal with that? And that's an important part of the puzzle. Another important point that I always try and focus on and make sure that everybody understands this, and we've kind of covered it in the last panel as well, which is good, is that these technologies are not identity in their own right. They are technology. They can be used to support it and to help us create an identity in inverted commas. But we rely on lots of other different sources to correlate and prove and get a really good proof of identity. And some of that might be assisted by these technologies, but it doesn't come from these technologies, and we need to focus on that. One of the other things that I think is very interesting to think about is that security to users is really only interesting when it hurts them. So if I'm going to come to harm, then I'm interested about security. But most of the time, I want to complete a transaction. I want to open that bank account. I want to buy that thing online. I want to start that business. I'm less worried in those situations about how big the padlock is that's protecting it. I'm more interested in, well, if things go wrong, how am I protected? And those are the things we need to focus on, I think. So in short, for my liking, the 4 pillars that we're going to talk about on this panel should really just be silent, supportive, and easily understood. And if they can do that, they will be very effective.
I agree with that. So I'm a cybersecurity guy. I've worked for 20 years protecting companies and then countries at the C level in governments as well. And I don't trust anyone. That's my background, and I shouldn't. And you're right. You don't need to. People don't need to know the underlying foundations of transactions and how it works. They just need to know it's safe, and they have to have the assurance that it's safe. And that's what we do as security guys. We give assurance. So what I've done, I had a problem, and I was in government, and I was really annoyed about blockchain in 2015. I actually got introduced to it in 2009 when I was at Treasury. I got the government behind it to understand what it is, and it was way too early, but I kept working on it. And people said today it's a accounting technology and a legal technology. I'm going to say it's a security technology, so we need to have some debate. It's cryptography, Merkle trees, tokenization, all the things that we've had in security for years put together in a different way. So I had a problem with blockchain because in 2015 it was the dark road, Silk Web, the dark web, Silk Road era, and the technology is a good technology because, as Adam was saying, it gives you that underlying trust between parties that don't need to trust each other, and because you can trust the network, and that's what it does. So around 2015, I was working on it for the Department of Health, and I had a problem, and I wanted to legitimize it to have government regulate blockchain. And what I wanted to do was to regulate without regulation. And so I set down the path of creating the ISO standard. So I founded TC307 really for the purpose of legitimizing the technology. And that was 2015. And the biggest opposition was in government. The government was saying, no, we don't want this. This is too early. This is going to hinder innovation. We don't need to standardize the technology. But I kept pushing, and eventually we got it through. So now there's 46 countries working on it to standardize the technology. And that just means eventually in 2020 it will be published. We can have interoperable systems, interoperable regulation, interoperable governance for blockchain to benefit people. And that's where we're heading. So I think we're on the right track with that. And it's allowing people to get trust. And if you remember, the internet was built with the same mechanism. The internet was a trusted network the 20 operators in 1969 or whatever it was knew each other, and if something happened, you just called them and said, what's happening? And then you just sort it out. But as the internet grew, as the network became bigger and bigger, people didn't know everyone and they couldn't trust each other anymore. And so we built a whole cybersecurity industry around this, which was great for me because it was great timing. But we've built a whole security culture around the internet to protect us from each other. And that shouldn't be the case. But with the blockchain technology that we have now, we can actually honor that vision of the internet, where we can have a network that we can trust that gives us that implicit trust to trust other people. And that's where we're heading.
Fantastic. And Jeff, do you want to do an intro?
Yeah, so first of all, I wanted to express that I broadly agree with Adam as well, in that there is nothing new under the sun. And in particular, it's a shame that there aren't more financial people with us today here at Chartered Accountants Hall, in particular because many of these kinds of challenges have emerged in the financial industry. And I'll talk about some of them. But in particular, we talk about smart contracts. We look at, I spent 10 years in the financial industry before coming to UCL. And we think about futures contracts, derivatives contracts of all stripes, and smart contracts are not all that much different. The questions are very similar. Are they going to be fungible? Who is going to execute them? What are the preference orderings of the claims? These are the kinds of questions that, this industry has been grappling with for a very long time. And I think it's important to put this in context. P.T. Barnum had said there's a sucker born every minute. At the end of the day, really, these systems or these questions that we're asking are not new. So I've been working on TC 307. I've been convening one of the working groups on the standardization of blockchain and distributed ledger technologies. And let me tell you, there are parallels between this kind of technology and technologies that we have seen before. Internet standardization really began in the 1960s. So IEEE became one of the first standards bodies looking at that. Ultimately, it gave rise to the development of groups such as IETF and other standards bodies that have come to promulgate internet standards. It has always been the case that we've needed to build consensus around what we're doing, because interoperability is the watchword when it comes to getting these people to agree on how to connect with each other. And this is, make no mistake, about connection. EDI, electronic data interchange, very similar, 1970s, 1980s. Again, 30 years to become commercially viable to the extent that, more or less, to the extent that it's in popular parlance perhaps, but it was always on our minds that this would be in the future. To the question of privacy. You have one identity. That is what Mark Zuckerberg wants us to believe. He actually said, he went as far as to say, having two identities for yourself is an example of the lack of integrity. And I think that perhaps he did not spend enough time in his classes at Harvard when he perhaps should have been studying some very simple examples of history where people must have multiple identities in order to carry out their day-to-day lives in peacetime or in war. It's essential. It is part of what makes us human. We see this in the financial context as well. In 1968, U.S. Senate testimony, a researcher, Paul Armour of the Rand Corporation, gave very interesting remarks on the future of a cashless versus less cash society and electronic funds transfer. He characterized electronic funds transfer systems as perhaps the greatest possible way to get a surveillance system in place in the world. And when we look at cryptocurrencies and some of what we've been grappling with recently, we see the need for privacy in transactions as something palpable, as something that people are willing to fight for, and it's something that is changing in the era of big data because companies and other actors can source data in ways that they could not as recently as 10 to 20 years ago. So these questions have been around for half a century, but ultimately we're only now coming to the point where the risks of linking people's activities is is a major issue, and we need to address it, and we need some kind of a meeting of the minds. And this came up earlier about to what extent do GDPR address privacy, to what extent do people believe that people have a fundamental human right to privacy or an inalienable human right. These questions need to be asked by our leaders and our governments. And this brings us to the question of governance. We have a tension between cyber libertarians on the one side and institutions on the other. And I think part of the problem is that we're not communicating properly between these two groups. They both have a point. But unfortunately, they're speaking past each other. Let me tell you how. Regulators basically need to understand that it's not okay to have full dossiers on every individual transaction, everything, all the information that we can possibly accumulate. Ed Snowden said something very interesting. He said, and I apologize if it's offensive that I invoke his name, but it is true what he said, I believe, that there is no question that the police and law enforcement officials will behave more effectively if they are given all of the information in the world. However, I would rather live in a world in which the activities of the police are more constrained. And I think we need to decide what those constraints will be. And I think we need to decide where we're going to draw the line, the baseline, for the collection and aggregation of data. Now, the cyber libertarians, on the other hand, they don't have it all right either. We need a legal context for adjudicating disputes. We're talking about contracts. You know, it is a human question. This is not code as law. This is about interpretation of human interactions. If we don't have a legal context for adjudicating disputes, we have nothing. We need secure, well-functioning markets. Look at the financial crisis, not of this century, but of the last one in the 1920s, where we saw broker-dealers abusing their power at the center of the network. And we saw what we needed to build in order to prevent broker-dealers from front-running their clients, in order to prevent trading volumes being pumped up, and other kinds of malfeasance. We needed a regulatory oversight of that system in order for that to work. And finally, we need the system to be accountable to its users, not just the select few. We look at systems like proof of stake, proof of work, they look great, but the problem is that all of these systems give power to those who can actually afford the kinds of mechanisms that give them more computation, more capacity, more electricity. I mean, it all comes down to money in the end. And as a result, these systems are not as decentralized as they promise. They are not immutable. DLTs are not immutable. They can be changed, as we have seen with a number of forks. Bitcoin versus Bitcoin Cash, Ethereum versus Ethereum Classic. These have transpired because of disputes for which the community of the people in control have decided to change things. So we must not blithely assume that we have an immutable system. It may be tamper resistant, but it's not the same. And I'd like to close with some comments on identity. We should be thinking about this in the context of credentials, not one unified identity. Who issues the credentials? I can represent many different aspects of me. I can represent perhaps a passport, a driver's license. I can share other kinds of certificates, marriage certificates, birth certificates, et cetera, et cetera. They're all aspects of me, but they don't have to be linked forcibly. And there are human reasons why they're not linked. And we should respect and understand what these human reasons are. Credentials also need not be unique identifiers either. They could just be attributes. I can represent at a pub that I'm over 18 years old and can therefore purchase that pint without necessarily exposing my age, much less my name, or any other feature about me that can uniquely be traced back. Technology at some level is too important to leave to the technologists alone. This is a broader conversation, and this is a conversation that we need to have. And regulation is not always the enemy. There are many examples, and we can get into them if we have time, where regulation has actually inspired innovation, it has broken monopolies, it has created infrastructures, leveraging technology developed by self-regulatory organizations. This is the kind of thing that we can build with these technologies. Ask not what DLT, how to regulate DLT. Ask how we can use DLT to achieve our goal as a community. Thank you.
Thanks for all three of you. Boy, did I know we were going to have some fun on this panel. So I want to get out of the way. But one thing I want to start that with is that I thought I was starting to hear from Gilbert and even Adam to some extent saying, oh, the technology doesn't matter, let it do its thing, it solves some cool problems, we can just get on and use it. I thought that's what I was starting to hear. And some of those aspects I'm all for. Anything that makes life easier is good. And then I was delighted when Jeff, as I knew he would, started to uncover some of the things saying life just isn't that easy. And so what I want to understand, and I want you guys and everybody here in the room to help me and maybe the rest of us understand, is where are those really nitty-gritty problems that everybody's just avoiding at the moment because we want to get on and use the stuff. And I'll start with one, and I know there's already a hand up there, which I'll come to you, Patrick, very quickly, is the fundamental problem I see with all of this is we say no one's in control and you don't have to trust anyone, but there are people in control. Somebody's making decisions about code base. Things could change, and there's a whole world of users out there and corporates, if we can get technology adopted that way, where that matters to, because that's going to cause problems. And we can't just ignore that and say, well, let's go on with it anyway, because there are some mechanisms out there that we can use it. Where do we need something different, or we need to be thinking differently because of the way this technology works? That's what I'd like to try and get, but we've already got a question, so as I said, I'm getting out of the way and leaving it up to you guys. So, Patrick, can you press the button as well? I know you're loud, but it works better with the button.
Thank you. I think that was a compliment, but I'm not sure. Why should I trust you guys? You guys all know each other. Maybe you collude. In the DG Home Expert Group in the EU, the top issue for crime in Europe was identity fraud. And they then set up, or the Belgians did, a program called ASIN-P, which was all to do with anti-collusion inside governments on the issuance, government-issued credentials. Now, given that 50% of our panel has government experience, you're going to get off the hook, maybe, Jeff, I'm not sure. What I'd like to know is what we can do in industry to help government make sure that on the inside they understand this is national risk in an international context, not just a government thingy, and that they need to come to the table and help us in the collusion problem. Please could the panel comment?
As somebody who's only recently left the UK government, I think I can talk about it relatively authoritatively. You're absolutely right, Patrick. Government needs to come to the table. There are traditionally and the types of documents that governments produce, passports, driving licenses, identity cards, they're all used in various ways to prove identity. And they are all flawed in some way, shape or form. We know that there are fraudulent documents issued every year for all of those things. We know this. We know that when they're consumed by organisations to prove somebody's identity, they're quite often not checked correctly, so that they're not, we don't look at the particular, all the hard work that goes into putting security technologies into these documents quite often don't get used. And there's a lot of security theatre about where people take photocopies of my passport and put it in a drawer and forget about it because they think they've proved who I am. And that's not the truth. So yes, governments need to really take this to heart and sit down and join the conversation. And I think we're starting to get some traction in that. I think there is a realisation that to make things more effective and more reliable and to try and defeat some of this fraud, which is, you're absolutely right, the absolute massive, biggest number one threat, not just to individuals, but to governments. And we've known that for a long time, the UK government, that it is something that we need to start taking seriously. And I mean, and you'll appreciate we're starting that process, but it's very difficult to get those people around the table sometimes because of other priorities. I mean, there's this very small thing called Brexit going on at the moment, which makes people's diaries fill up quite quickly. I felt that myself when I was in government, but I also know that there are plenty of people in there who do see this as a major problem. And I think it's our role collectively, people in this room, as experts and as people working to solve these problems, to try and find a way to get that conversation going with them. And some of the forums that are popping up at the moment, so homes, for example, and all these kind of things that are happening now are very useful. But it's up to us to, we can't wait for these things to happen because government won't lead it. We have to lead it. And I think that's the important message I give.
Never thought you'd say that, but thank you.
Patrick, I think you let Adam off the hook a bit there. You started with a question about collusion. We got onto identity, so both are important. But what about the collusion issue that Patrick raised? You know, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with bad actors? Where can problems arise, and what's the mechanism for dealing with that? Yeah.
Well, if I can start, I want to raise two things. One is that if you're willing to break the law, you have many different options at your disposal that go well beyond the limited bounds of any particular payment system, any particular communication system. We're, I think, really interested in systems that can be deployed for the interest of ordinary law-abiding citizens and individuals. This is really what this is about. And you know, I don't want to go into detail about saying, well, let's consider this in the context of the Rawlsian veil of ignorance and make sure that we're serving the least well-connected, least privileged among us. But I think it's true. And I think that the major issue here that we have with deploying these systems is that we're trying to impose, in many cases, from the top down, a way of thinking about this. And I think many of the identity systems that we've seen proposed and used, indeed, in countries such as Estonia, India, are very highly centralized. They are a top-down kind of model where everyone has to buy into the truth and effectiveness of this model to use it. I think that we should think about ways that we can instead promote interoperability and focus upon the authorities and networks that exist today so that business networks can establish trust relationships on their own terms, since we know they will anyway, and abandon the idea of trying to impose something from on high that forces everyone to accept a trust model that they don't accept. So can we focus instead on providing a way that people can communicate and build trust on their own terms? That's the question.
I thought we were talking about blockchain today, but you know, we're talking about the trust issue. And as a security person, you have to trust something, and no system is perfect, no system is secure. And government is a good pillar of trust because it's established, it's democratic usually in most countries. You know, at the end of the day, if you don't trust your government, then things start falling apart. So there's controls in place that give us visibility and transparency to weed out the bad actors and collusion. And you know, we can put technical controls, people controls, process controls to deter the bad actors. But there will be some. It's just the cost of our society. We've always had that within the human the societal system that we live in. But you can reduce it and you can tolerate it. So from a risk perspective, we all have thresholds, and you know, you can minimize it to the extent where it is more tolerable than a higher level, and that way you have more trust because it's just a cost of doing business, a cost of running society. So we will, whatever we put in place now or in 50 years' time, it's all, you know, quantum, blockchain, AI, you know, put all those things together. There will be similar failures in the system that we have today, but just in a different way. So we just have to adopt as the technology progresses.
One of the characteristics of trust that's interesting is that it's easier to trust someone who doesn't have latitude to be untrustworthy. If And we can talk about this in a game theoretic context in the game of chicken, for example, where someone throws away the steering wheel, and then you know that they're going to crash into you or else. But I like to think that in distributed ledger technologies, the value is actually less is more. And what makes for an effective use of a distributed ledger technology inside a community is being able to say, you can attack me, but the system will go on. I'm not in control. I don't have that kind of power. Can we actually all agree to use a system that allows us all to relinquish credibly our ability to abuse? And this is a very powerful primitive for building trust. And if we can use these kinds of DLT mechanisms to express that we are not in control because control is distributed, then maybe that is a way that we can be more effective.
Adrian Field from Lloyds Banking Group. So it's a question about trust and who and what am I trusting. So in the postman scenario, I don't think I necessarily need to trust my postman. You know, if I go into a shop and use a card to buy something, I don't necessarily need to trust the service. I need to trust that redress mechanism. And in the blockchain DLT space, you know, fine, there's trust in the technology, but it's actually the service and the intermediary that I'm really worried about, and the governance and the brand, the reputation, the loyalty, all the kind of more human aspects of that. So I think the trust is actually more important in the service layer than the technology. And how, you know, what do you think about that?
You're absolutely right that trust is multifaceted. Whenever we decide whether we trust something or not, we don't just do it on one thing, one piece of knowledge, one interaction. It's a risk-based assessment that we're making at any one point in time. And it depends not just on the actors and the knowledge that we have around them. It depends on what we're trying to do. So you're absolutely right. In some circumstances, the postman might just be bringing me a birthday card. Very low trust. In some circumstances, he might be delivering a parcel that's worth quite a lot of money. And in those two different circumstances, I have different levels of trust. I get anxious about the parcel arriving on time and whether or not it's going to get left on my doorstep and somebody might take it and all these kind of things. When it's just a letter, I don't care. But it's the same postman, it's the same methods, the same organisations. It's just a different transaction. So you're absolutely right. There are so many different variables in that whole question of trust that we have to appreciate in all of this. And that being able to have those risk assessments and some of the things I think Jeff was talking about where sometimes I don't need to disclose anything to be able to prove that I can do a thing. If I just need to prove that I am of a certain age or that I am a real human even. I mean, nobody's actually said that. I mean, proving that you're a human is actually quite important in all of these things sometimes and not a bot. Because in transactions that might actually be really useful. Or alive or dead or whatever it might be. And that will stem largely from what you're trying to do at any one particular time with who and why. And we have to accept that all that variability is something that we do in our heads all the time, every day. But you have to make sure that you do that properly in the technology.
Yes.
Hi, Jiro Walcott from Guard Global. Just wanted to go back to the issue of, there's the regulatory issue and the DLT and the gap, and and the fact that the UK government, HMRC, Companies House, is apparently not doing very much, or have, they're stuck in a like a glacier or something. My question is, is the UK government asking for information or data which it can digest seamlessly? And are all the firms, technologies, the people who are creating the data structures for these smart legal contracts, etc., providing this information in a format that the HMRC and Companies House and the UK government in general can digest seamlessly? There was a gentleman up here talking about text contracts which are not legible by computers and things. This technology is just waiting to happen, but it's a matter of the stakeholders coming together and providing this service. There's no mystery about it, really. And the UK government is perfectly in a position to accept all this structured data, whether it's from smart legal contracts or DLT transactions, completely and utterly in a structured format, but it's not really happening because I'm not sure if there's a lack of demand or it's not being offered by the organizations that are, developing this.
I can talk to that. So government is doing a lot in this space, actually. The UK government is, especially this year. That DLT has been around for quite a while. The Satoshi paper was 2009, so technically they've been looking at it since then. They've been experimenting with different aspects and use cases with DLT, and the only challenge I've seen is it's been done independently. So departments have been doing things on their own, and it's just become joined up and collaborative in the last year or so. And it's not just government going out and saying every HMRC VAT submission has to be on DLT. They're not gonna regulate it that way. They're gonna say every VAT or tax submission should be compatible and readable with existing systems. So their policy won't define the technology, but it'll define the method of how the technology should work. And having said that, government can't solve it on their own. There are numerous collaborative groups that are private-public partnerships that are working together to solve this jointly. It's not just the private sector saying, we're going to create a banking DLT, we're going to create a health DLT, and government has to use it. It's actually, they're at the table. And with the standardization work that I'm involved in the UK committee, it is a mix of academia, government, all different sectors of government, not just one or two, and startups and individuals. So it is a very joined up approach to solve this. But I think it's still a bit early to solve, and it's progressive. So we will see adoption later on, probably in 2 to 3 years' time. It won't happen overnight, but we're on the road to make it happen.
Okay, I mean, it seems that there's no sort of like a specific strategy, a unified strategy. And I give you an example. There's what Accord was talking about, this decentralized identity in a data structure. But that data structure, that after I've looked at it, is completely incompatible with the data structure used for submissions to HMRC, for instance. I mean, it's like this. Whereas if, with a bit of thought, this decentralized ID data structure could be 100% compatible with HMRC submissions. But it hasn't been done because no one's actually thinking about it seems.
I'm not entirely sure it's because nobody's thinking about these problems. I mean, they are being tackled within government. I mean, HMRC themselves, I spent quite some time with them, probably 18 months ago now, maybe 2 years ago, helping them with other input from across government to understand the potential of distributed ledger technology and how it could transform their business. And bear in mind, HMRC is not just one thing. There are 13 heads of business, I think, in HMRC, none of which are that well connected at all. They're essentially separate entities. It's an organisation that's been merged from one thing to another over the years. So you've got the revenue and customs part, and it is different to other things. So there is lots of institutional issues that they're trying to solve. They've got lots of services that are largely born out of paper. It's a massive transformation project. And in and amongst all that, they're trying to understand, well, how can things like DLT actually help them? And they see lots of potential. So you've got that big effort towards transformation, but transformation in government is traditionally slow. I know, I was in Government Digital Service, I tried to make it happen. It's hard. It's not an easy thing. The other thing that gets in the way of this, and I think Helen may have said this earlier, is that it takes a long time to change policy in government. And whilst there is a will from many of those trying to solve the problems, there are political issues that get in the way sometimes. And we have to keep trying to move them forward. This is why I said earlier, it's our responsibility to keep those conversations going, because otherwise they'll get lost in the mire of government. And that's very, very important. Because most of the people in HMRC are trying to solve day-to-day problems. They're trying to solve things like, we've got a massive peak for self-assessment because it's the end of January, and the whole of HMRC gets behind that because it's the big problem of the day. And these things just don't go away from them, for them as an organisation. They have to keep that ball rolling constantly, while at the same time trying to figure out how to take themselves into the next century.
this is I just wanted to point out, this is not an IT problem. This is really an organizational problem at the human level. And I guess it was made most salient by a defense contractor that I spoke with a few months ago. Some director of strategy had said to me, well, you know, we've moved from an RFP world where we would have bidders on solutions into a platform world where now if we want to be consultants, we can just tell people what platform to use and we're done. I don't think that works here. So I think that we need to be patient whilst also knowing that we are going to have to agree at some level on what the protocols for interaction are going to be, whether that's within a government or a business or across governments and businesses. And I think that it's a mistake to think of DLT as a universal database in the cloud. We have databases for that. Universality is a Tower of Babel. We don't want that. We'll be seeing many DLTs deployed in many contexts. And the question is, which contexts are the right ones for the right purpose, purpose-built DLTs within their own contexts.
We've got a few minutes left, I think about 5 or 6 before we break for lunch. And listening to all of this and the other workshops we've held, and I'm sure the ones that are to come, I don't know whether I'm starting to change my view on all of this. I really thought this is something new, and these are distributed ecosystems which attempt to build elements of governance and trust into the technology, so we don't have to worry about it. You know, the problem's been taken away for us. And I thought that was too simplistic, and there was a need for other things around all of this. And the more I listen to these guys, I'm starting to think maybe we don't. Maybe there's no new problems here, and maybe all the mechanisms that we've got today in terms of law and governance mechanisms and consortia agreements, maybe that's all fine. You know, we need to stop worrying about this so much. I don't know, but as a closing, I'd like each of the panel members to say, are there any new problems here when we look at the governance and the trust in these technologies and the way we use them? Or do we just get out of our own way and carry on with it?
Yeah, for me, it's quite simple. We've had to build in a whole bunch of systems to trust each other. And what DLT technology does is it cuts all that out and makes it more efficient. So we don't need to have multiple, clearinghouses. We don't need to have escrow. We don't need to have all those lawyers as well to do those things to get that trust. So we can actually use the technology to bypass something that's overtly complex and making it very simple. And that's the societal benefit that I see, because we're simplifying existing processes to make them more efficient because we can trust each other easier.
I think from my point of view, one of the things that I think about a little bit and worry about a little bit is what is quite often referred to as the fourth industrial revolution. And we had a lovely panel about this at EIC in Munich a few weeks back, where we were asked sort of, what's scary about that? And one of the things that's scary about the fourth industrial revolution is the speed of change. And these kind of technologies can industrialize things that we've done outside of technology before. And they can help us to do them much faster and much more efficiently and at much greater scale. And that, for me, builds problems in the future that we don't understand yet. So I'm not saying there's problems with the technology per se. We need to do these things. It's human nature. We move forward. We do that all the time. We always have done. The difference here in the fourth industrial revolution is that the hockey stick has really gone vertical. And before, where we had time to figure out how to solve problems because they happened gradually, now they're happening before we know it. And that is something we need to have in the back of our minds the more we do this.
That's a great point. And Jeff, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I find myself agreeing with Adam again. I think that there really are useful frictions in the world that we've come to depend upon for various reasons in various contexts. And some of the advances in technology have led to reduce the presence of these frictions, and they've exposed some vulnerabilities that we have in terms of resolving certain kinds of problems. And we need to respond as a society to how we're going to resolve those those new tests that have emerged because these frictions are becoming less effective. In particular, efficiency is not always good. Sometimes we want a system that's less efficient if it helps us be perhaps more democratic or perhaps more fair. And we should think carefully about these kinds of technologies as mechanisms that might be part of a greater toolbox that can be used to deliver more democratic or more fair solutions to resolving interactions between businesses, between individuals, etc. I think of DLT as really emerging at this time as a response to the emergence of platforms and platform businesses, which in many cases exist for the purpose of aggregating data and controlling populations, or they exist for the purpose of collecting economic rents through monopoly, what have you. I think that there is coming to be a groundswell of belief that we need to have a mechanism for saying less is more. We need to have a mechanism for saying I am not in control, and that's where I see the value.
Well, I just say thank you very much to the panelists, and please show your appreciation.